Hi there, I'm Dan Jones. Welcome to the podcast. I'm an oceanographer working at the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge, UK. Here I have conversations with people whose work intersects with climate in some way. I started this podcast because I like talking with and learning from these folks. Some of you might be new here, so welcome and thanks for coming aboard. In a few minutes of podcast time here, I'll be talking with Eric Holthaus, who describes himself as a meteorologist, climate journalist, and a writer. So Eric has a new book out called The Future Earth, a radical vision for what's possible in the age of warming. It has been out since late June in the US, and it was just released in the UK in early August. It's a pretty amazing book in several ways, which we'll talk about soon. I finished it a few days before the interview, and honestly, it has made me rethink some things. I think I'm someone who kind of intellectualizes climate change and the Earth system in general, which is consistent with my day job where I'm supposed to help figure out how the Earth system works. I perhaps don't spend enough time listening to what my body's telling me, and maybe I don't let my emotional response have enough space in there. And ultimately, if Eric is right, addressing the climate crisis has to go a lot further than technology and policy. If he's right, we have to use our imaginations and our kind of emotional realities and conjure up a new way of living with each other that's based on consent and reciprocity and mutual care, as Eric says in the conversation in a few minutes here. That's how you build a society where we're less likely to take advantage of each other and less likely to produce harm, both to ourselves and to future generations. We could be talking about like an enormous intentional shift in how society is organized. At least that's the kind of vision that Eric has articulated very nicely in this book. And I think it's compelling. I think it's interesting. I think we had for this podcast a relatively serious, kind of calm conversation that just seemed to be how we were both feeling at the time, which of course is fine. I liked it, and I hope that you will enjoy it as well. So that's probably enough for me for now. I don't think I need to cover anything else. So let's just go ahead and get into this conversation with Eric Holthaus. Here we go. Yeah, cool. So what's up today? What have you been doing? Do you have a lot of these to do?
I just finished recording with Minnesota Public Radio, which is our main public radio station here in the Twin Cities. And that was exciting. My partner just texted me and said, I'm listening to you on the radio right now. So that's cool.
That's nice.
Yeah. I got to do Science Friday, which is another big NPR show, a national show a couple weeks ago.
That's
and awesome. Other than that, a few reviews here and there. It is the kind of book that I think is not going to be a New York Times bestseller. I don't think I was ever intending that. But I think where it is hitting off really well is in academic circles with professors who are looking for sort of an intro college book for high school kids and for college freshmen. I think that it's actually hitting off pretty well. Like I think I've had 15 or 20 people reach out to say they're going to use it in teaching this fall.
Oh, nice. That's exciting.
Yeah, and I think that this is a sort of frame that is, I intended this from the beginning, that is sort of trying to rewrite the narrative of what we think of when we think about climate change. So
for sure, yeah.
That was my goal. And it's really nice to see it resonating with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely what I'd love to talk about. So first, yeah, thanks for being here. I want to make sure that I say that explicitly, because I always feel that way, but it's nice to actually explicitly say it.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks. Yeah, I really loved the book. So I just finished it last week in preparation for our interview. And there's so much we could talk about. And it's good that you've gotten the opportunity to discuss it in lots of different venues. So I guess the best way to go about it for me is probably just to talk about the parts of it that resonated with me, and then probably that will translate to something that some people will pick up on in the book.
I'd love that. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. So I was struck by this quote. Dr. Sam Earle. Is that how you pronounce her last name?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, and actually, first, how do you pronounce your last name? I thought I should ask that.
Holthaus. Eric Holthaus.
Holthaus. Okay, there you go. Yep. Thanks. Cool. So this quote from Dr. Sam Earle, who's at the University of East Anglia, which is not far from here. That's Norwich. That's just a short train ride from here if one is willing to brave the train at the moment. But she had this phrase about every moment we can reproduce the current imaginary, which, as I understood it from the book, is kind of how we conceive of the structures in the world and how we conceive of the possibilities in the world, or we can challenge that current imaginary and reimagine it, think of a different future, think of a different set of possibilities. And that seems to me one of the points of the book is that you were saying that imagination is really important, that our ability to think of different futures and different possibilities is really important. And for some reason, we seem to be struggling with that. We seem to be stuck in either we're kind of stuck with this, dichotomy of, we either have to work within the current system or we have to construct something entirely new. And I also notice a lot of people get stuck in the old binary of like, well, it's either capitalism or communism, and those are your only two options, and then there's no other possibilities there. So I thought you're expressing the idea that imagination is really important. That resonated with me. And
I think that the options are infinite. Of course, there's an infinite number of ways to construct a political economic system in every country. So I think that putting labels on things unnecessarily limits us, for sure. So I think that that's where the imaginary comes in, is that, the way Professor Earle uses or Dr. Earle, I'm not sure if she's a professor yet, but I think the way she talks about imaginary is that this is your guiding framework for how you operate in the world. So your imaginary is your mental image of what society is, or what proper behavior is, or the fact that you wear shoes on your hand or in your feet instead of your hands, or like they're conventions. There are sort of unthinking ways we go about the world. And I think that's what she's trying to interrogate here, is that we don't often have an opportunity to dive straight into the core of what human civilization is, of what we're working to here to do. And that is, she's talking, her work focuses on liminal moments, liminal spaces, that we have these sort of transition times between imaginaries where everything is up for grabs. And that is where we are right now when it comes to climate change, specifically, especially, even more so during the middle of a pandemic that's within the climate emergency. So we are right now looking around for leadership. We're looking around for the new way. And there's no clear path, which is why people are feeling so much anxiety and so much uncertainty. Talking about where we want to go, what our values are, what matters to us, is the way through. We have to construct the new imaginary before we can live in it.
Yeah, that resonated with me a lot, and it is a little bit of a contrast. There's a little bit of a contrast between, it's not so much a proposal of yours in the book, but the theme that you're exploring of, no, let's open up all possibilities and think about a completely new way to organize society. There's a contrast between that and the kind of solutions that I hear from some people who are involved in climate science, some climate scientists and some other folks who are thinking about different pathways. They will say, well, things like a carbon tax or things like a just renewed investment in these technologies, that all of those can help get us out of this problem, can get us out of the climate crisis. And I'm not putting you on the spot or anything. I'm just highlighting that as an interesting contrast. Some folks kind of come at this and say, well, if we just tweak a couple of things, we'll be able to, still stay within roughly the current framework that we have. But on the other side of that is, no, this is a big opportunity. We can change more than just how we do our energy system. We can think about changing our social systems and think about changing even the indigenous rights and rights across societies and kind of everything. So I'm kind of interested in what got you. I'm interested in what got you into thinking about. Actually, this isn't just about a carbon tax or a couple of policy changes. This is such an opportunity to blow everything apart. What kind of got you to that place?
Well, I think I think it came from just listening. I'm a journalist. I started my career as a climate scientist, and now I'm a journalist. Sort of thinking about interviews that I did, just like this one, really. Is where we're just sort of thinking about what people's priorities are, how they diagnose the problem, what they think the solutions are, what they think the problem is to begin with. I think that the problem goes much more deeply in society than just how we use energy and what energy sources we use. I think there are fundamental systemic injustices like racism and colonialism and extractive capitalism that have persisted for 500 years on the planet that gave rise to climate change. I think climate change is a symptom of those problems, not really the problem itself. So if all you're trying to do is just use, the classic example is using natural gas instead of coal, because natural gas is sort of in a perfect idealized system, natural gas releases less carbon dioxide than coal does when it's burned because of the chemical reaction that happens when you burn it. But we don't live in an idealized system. And in the US, emissions have now shifted almost entirely to natural gas when it comes to energy production. And so you've now locked in another 30 or 40 or 50 years of infrastructure that's a sunk cost that we could have just went straight to renewable energy, or that still just thinking about sources of energy, wondering what happened to create a system where we centralized our energy production in the first place. Nature shows us that energy production is and should be decentralized. Plants have leaves that are decentralized across his body, across the plant's body.
So by centralized, you mean like having individual power plants that do the generation, and then you send it out to.
Yeah, exactly. Biomass inherently is a decentralized way of producing energy. That is what evolved over the last, 500 million years on the planet. So, yeah, you use it where you need it, or you make it where you need it.
Make it where you need it. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's what I think in a perfect world, that's what solar and wind do as well. But we're not in a perfect world where we have now massive utility companies that are centralizing solar and wind, just like they centralized coal and natural gas. And so we are sort of trending down that path where even renewable energy is not it's not obvious if it's a good thing just on its face, because it in some cases lives in that previous imaginary. If we want to keep talking about imaginaries, it lives in that previous way of doing things where you centralize power and control and energy production and money, really, to the net detriment of the broader population. And so there's a risk here that if we are not cutting deep enough into the previous imaginary, that we will recreate the problems of the past.
Right. So just to dig into that a little bit more, so a centralized approach to energy, that's having power plants and distributing it, and then a localized or decentralized approach to energy production. That's like putting solar panels on your house, for example, just to be concrete. You make it right there. You make the energy right there,
Yep.
where you need it. And the analogy you were drawing is that, photosynthesis, plants photosynthesize. They make the energy there, where they live. Yeah. So to back up to the other bit, there was a nice thread that you mentioned that I wanted to dig into a little bit more. You mentioned that these economic systems that we live with and these social systems and some of the inequalities that exist within those systems are tied into the problem of climate change, or climate change is almost a symptom of those. Can we dig into that a little bit more? What
Sure.
are some of the ways in which they're all connected?
Yeah, I think the most important one is this idea of consent and exploitation. So if you're living in a society that is focused on consent and reciprocity and mutual care, you are less likely to take advantage of each other or to produce harm. I mean, at a very basic level, you are working together for mutual benefit of each other. And I think that sort of the opposite of that society is a society that's based on exploitation, where one person tries to sort of extract resources from other people and from the land with the intent of taking some off the top, and that is they extract their benefit, what they need to survive, from other people. That system devolves quickly. I mean, and it can concentrate wealth and power pretty quickly, which is what we have seen over the last 500 years. Really, is that system sort of take control as the dominant system in the world. The discovery of fossil fuel burning helped reinforce that system, where you had this extremely high density energy material that facilitated that way of structuring society. Whereas before, like if you had a global society that was built on biomass as its primary fuel, again, it's decentralized. It's not that you can't like hoard an entire country's worth of forest and burn it as easily as you could hoard an entire country's supply of coal and centralize that, and build these massive like sailing ships and go and like invent guns and like take over an entire continent. So I think that that it will at this point take a conscious effort for us to choose again that that world that is focused more on reciprocity and care and mutual aid rather than on mutual, or like systematic exploitation.
Right. And that, I think, connects nicely with, when I say connects nicely, I mean is consistent with, like, I just finished this book called Superior, and it's an anti-racist book. Basically traces some of the history of certain strands of racist thought. And the author, whose name I've forgotten, I'll try to remember to link it when I post this episode. One of her kind of points was to say, well, remember that racism was created. It's a PR thing. That it was generated.
It's a technology, if you want to think about it that way.
To make certain people believe or feel like, oh well, this group is better than this other group. The group that you're part of is better than this other group, and actually we deserve to go to this other continent and take it over, just because, well, we're superior. We look at all the stuff we've done. We're clearly a superior group. We should just go around the planet and continue consuming resources and continue taking things because, well, we're making it better, right? So that line of racist thought seems to generate, right? It's very easy to see that producing an exploitative way of looking at the world, where you see everything as a commodity, everything as something that you can potentially kind of churn through, whether it's grabbing land or grabbing resources, grabbing labor. And there's also systems of thought and prejudice there that try to sort people into classes, right? And then you imagine, oh, there's classes who are going to kind of be doing the work, and then there's classes who's going to be making all of the money. And there are systems of thought that reinforce those kind of, in these kind of inequalities. So I think that what you said does paint a little bit more of a picture of me of how something like racism, something like a kind of classism almost too, can lead to this kind of exploitative system where you're not, the people operating the system are not concerned with mutual care. They're pursuing their own, self-interest. And in the States, I mean, I'm from the States originally, but in the States, that's almost one of the romantic ideals that is kind of propagated, isn't it? Is the whole the self-interest, rugged individualism, and whatnot. And that, I guess, can work if everybody, if under some circumstances, but it's easy to see. And like you said, we've seen plenty of evidence of this kind of leading to exploitation and leading to centralization and leading to big inequalities. And so I think it is going to be important to kind of address those, to address those kind of systems of thought, seeing as how you can see that they lead to this kind of climate crisis. I don't know if I didn't put that in the most eloquent way possible, but it's okay. This is an informal podcast. This is supposed to be just a conversational podcast. And I know I don't have you for very long, so I'm trying to be mindful of the time and trying to get things a little bit more focused, maybe here and there. So that kind of leads me to the next thing, is thinking about, I'm not really marching us through a set of questions. I just have some notes that I've taken from your book here. That's what I'm looking at over here. One of the phrases that you wrote that I really liked, that I responded to, was that we have to radically act in the present moment with the deep and transcendent love of visionaries. That phrase, you used the phrase visionaries in there, and you actually used the word love, which I really appreciated, because I think that is part of it. I think there is like there is a spiritual dimension to this, not necessarily like metaphysical, believing things in a woo-woo kind of way, but I just mean like a spiritual, like what's in our hearts and what's our level of caring for each other. And that in the way that you framed it in the book, we're not going to get our way out of the climate crisis unless we actually learn how to kind of have that caring, that mutual caring for each other, and to be able to look forward into the future with that kind of love and a kind of to be stubbornly optimistic and to be hopeful. You talk about getting out of binary thinking, getting out of this, us versus them, getting out of the thinking of it can only be one thing or the other. I like the phrase stubbornly optimistic too. I think that describes what that's what I aspire to anyway. You talk about shifting away from top-down control and centralization towards this kind of web of responsibility. And it's beautiful. Like you mentioned that it's a beautiful way to conceive of organizing society. You mentioned it's not built on guilt. It's not built on shame. It's not built on this kind of hyper-individualism. I'd like to know a little bit more about your kind of pathway to this way of thinking, because in my own ways, I've kind of been trying to head in that direction as well. I've trying to rethink some of the, for lack of a better term, some of the spiritual traditions that just relate to how do I relate to other people? How do I find that love? How do I plug into that love? And how do I plug into that hope and that kind of optimism for the future? So how do you, I know I'm throwing a lot out here, but like, how do you fuel all that? How do you fuel your optimism and your creativity and your hope and what's the engine that's driving all of this,
Yeah. I mean, in a practical sense, I'm trying to focus on reasons to get out of bed in the morning, if that makes sense. Of like, I want to wake up and be excited for the day. Yeah. And it is extremely hard to do if you have a vision of working on climate full time, where you think of it as sort of an inevitable dystopia. Like, there's not a whole lot of reason to do the work if you think that your work is meaningless. So I think that working on climate sort of requires some sort of level of optimism or hope or faith, if you want to use that word, faith, inherently, because it's it's a really depressing thing to work on if you let it get that way. I think maybe climate work draws that type of person potentially that is willing to take that leap of faith, and say that things can get better even though things are bad right now.
Hmm.
I mean, we have thousands of years of uh, philosophical and religious traditions of understanding that moment of saying, how do you act in uncertainty? How do you choose to go on when everything seems to be falling apart? I feel like the thread throughout religions is that at some point there's just no choice. It's just you have to do it because you're doing it for each other. You're not doing it for yourself.
Hmm.
So I think to me that's where the work comes from, is that people need me because I have responsibility, because I have gained so much from others. I want to do the same thing for someone else that all of my lifetime of conversations has done for me. So I feel like one thing that might be different, speaking as as a white man in the United States, during this period where I have really had a lot of opportunity to get my voice out there for a lot of structural reasons that don't really have anything to correspond to how good or bad my ideas are. But I think listening is an extremely important skill right now, and extremely important to practice that skill. And because the way to have hope for me is to think that the future is going to be pretty different than where we've come from, because we know that at least when it comes to climate, the past 50 years has been really a series of, I don't want to say setbacks, but more of just like doing nothing.
Hmm.
Doing nothing ends up being harmful when you are being called to change and you choose not to change. And I, that we could talk about that when it comes to anti-racism. We can talk about that when it comes to being, like being a dad or a partner or a citizen. We can talk about that when it comes to the IPCC said in the 2018 report on 1.5 degrees that in order to get a good chance at meeting that 1.5 degree target, it would require transformative change in all aspects of society. Apply that to your own life, and 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 sort of like think about how you're willing to create transformative change in your own life. And I feel like listening is probably the most transformative change that anyone can make, is just sort of step back and say, I'm not the point anymore. The point is not what I am going to be doing. It's going to be trusting each other, trusting your relationships to provide for you, in that sort of reciprocal way that we were talking about at the beginning. Say that we are in the middle of a transition from the society that's focused on exploitation and individualism towards a society that's focused on reciprocity and care and mutual aid. So living in that world, or like if you can try to live in that world as soon as possible, that's really what's all that's being asked of you, is
Yeah.
to try to inhabit that world and sort of show others what it's like. And I think listening is probably one of the most important ways to get into that world.
Yes, listening and making plenty of space for the idea that, well, there are going to be a lot of experiences out there, a lot of human experiences that you just don't have direct access to, that you just need to take other people's word for, because there's no way for you to test it yourself.
Yeah. Reading is a version of listening for sure. You are reading and incorporating other person's thoughts into your own brain. So
exactly. Yeah. Yes, and I really liked this. You mentioned all the thousands of years of spiritual and philosophical traditions about how to deal with uncertainty and how to relate to each other. I mean, you're right. The people have been working on this problem for a really long time, and that problem gets couched in various metaphysical things, which people may or may not find appealing, but they all do have something in common. Well, I don't know about all of them. I'm not like a scholar
Mm,
in that way, but
mm,
often a common theme is exactly what you said about it's about trusting in these interrelationships, trusting in something that is larger in scope than just your own individual self, trusting in
mm,
scope that is not directly accessible to you necessarily, but like
mm,
something that bigger than you that you could be a part of possibly, and cultivating those relationships with other people, like you're saying, listening and possibly meditating. Some traditions have meditation or prayer or something, and that's a very
mm,
centering, kind of calming kind of exercise.
mm,
So yeah, a lot of that's there, and I think there are people who are digging into this project of like how do you pull these the wisdom out of some of these old traditions and apply them to modern life. I also like what you said about we're in a transition from a more individually focused kind of world to one where we'll have to think about how our actions affect other people and how we can get going as as a single thing, as as a species, as a part of the
mm,
planet Earth. And I think that transition is not only a good idea, but it's like required. Like, I don't think we can continue down the same trajectory, the same really individualistic type trajectory that we've been kind
mm.
of embedded in. It's just not working anymore. Yeah, thank you for that. I wanted you to tell me, if you don't mind, a little bit more. At the end of the book, you have an action guide and you have some reflection exercises,
Mhm,
and a lot of them did have kind of themes that made me think of some of the Buddhist practices. So I talked with a couple episodes ago. I talked with a Buddhist practitioner who uses meditation, and he uses uh, other kind of Dharma practices, wisdom practices in his life and in his science. And it reminded me of that. Some of the things, meditation and embodiment and non-resistance, like not resisting the idea of what's
mhm,
happening now, accepting what's happening now,
mhm.
getting away from the ego. Can you tell me a little bit more about where that action guide came from and the reflection exercises?
Yeah, Caroline Contillo, who wrote the grief action guide, does come from a Buddhist tradition, so you did pick up on that. Uh, and I think that her writings in that guide, it's really sort of like informed, I think, by her own experiences of being a person who has struggled with grief and anxiety around climate change, and working through that in sort of trauma healing focused approach. And I think that is what I mean, because that's what's happening right now, is that climate scientists are working through trauma, even if we don't want to say it that way. Being in a science that is contemplating change on this scale, devoting your life to that as it's happening is really a traumatic experience.
I
That's sort of where it comes from.
the idea that we might need to like grieve the past climate that isn't coming back, that
Mm,
really struck with me. That really struck me, and I hadn't honestly thought that that might need to be a thing that I go through. You know what I mean?
mm,
Like, I do come from a scientific background and training and tradition and things, and I just hadn't. It seems obvious in retrospect, but like emotionally, I'm like, no, you might actually need to go through a process of grieving the things that have been lost. That
mm,
you know, I read stressful headlines and I read stressful
mm,
projections about the future, and yeah, you're absolutely
mm,
right that I probably have been not fully letting all of that sink in and not letting all that fully register.
mm,
That I don't know if part of that is just some some preservation or some
mm,
emotional pattern that I've gotten into, some self-preservation instinct or some emotional pattern that I've gotten into. But yeah, I think lately I've started to more explicitly grieve some of these things. To give you a
mm,
concrete example, so my dad lives on a bit of land in southeast Georgia. He's got pecan trees blueberry bushes. He's got a bunch of flowers and things surrounded by pine trees. It's on a dirt road. It's in the middle of nowhere. The thought occurred to me that like by the time my son is 8 years old, by the time my son is either my age or maybe his grandfather's age, I don't know if he'll be able to like literally survive the summers in Southeast Georgia, right? I mean, I don't know enough about the regional climate projections, and I understand as a climate scientist that regional climate projection is actually pretty hard. But we know it's going to, especially if things continue on the same trajectory, it's going to get warmer. The summers are already dangerously hot down there, right now at this level of warming, and it's only going to continue if that same kind of broad scale pattern applies to Southeast Georgia, which it likely will. Warm places tend to get warmer under this scenario. Wet places get wetter, dry places get drier. That seems to be what the projections suggest. So that has been a concrete thought that I've realized, oh, maybe I need to actually grieve that. I was born in Savannah. That's a coastal city. Sea level rise, could swallow that up or could swallow the edges of it up, certainly, as the decades go on. So I appreciate you explicitly putting that in the book because, for me, that's part of what I reacted to is like, oh, right. I might need to actually go through an emotional process here that it might not be enough for me to just intellectualize the whole thing, So I kind of want to hear your pathway into all this. What was it like to transition from meteorology to writing about and owning your own perspective so thoroughly? Because you've you've owned your own perspective so thoroughly, and you've been so vulnerable with us by sharing your hopeful, optimistic vision of the future. And I mean optimistic in the best way in terms of it is an expression of optimism, that stubborn optimism. That's what I was looking for. Could you tell us like a little bit more about what that pathway has looked like?
I mean, I think that it has been a journey for sure. I think that trying to articulate this book took place over a period of 6 years. I started the book when we were pregnant with our first kid 6 years ago. So writing this book has been about fatherhood. It's been about getting a divorce. It's been about all the political changes that we've happened over the last 6 years, and now the pandemic and the school strike movement and all of that factored in to kind of at the core of is what you're talking about. Is that at the beginning I started writing this with this looming grief over the world that was slipping away, and didn't know how to think or talk about it. I was originally kind of trying to think about it as an apology letter to my unborn child, really. That's really, but then I started thinking, like, that's pretty self-centered way of thinking about the entire climate problem just being a problem of my own emotional relationship with my kid. That's pretty weird. But as I started to report the book, realizing that this effort of visioning actually is really important when it comes to
kind of even conceiving of possibilities and of having that hope.
Yeah. In terms of say, like, I think what my like inner monologue is when I heard you talking about Savannah, and the way I talk about Kansas and in the book where I grew up, is that you sort of see this place slipping away or transforming into something that you don't recognize anymore, or that's different than what you know it as. Where my mind goes now, where it wouldn't have after or before I wrote this book, is that that's not inevitable. That's what climate science tells us is that an uninhabitable Savannah, Georgia is not inevitable. We can do work today, every day, to make that future not happen. So, and not only working to prevent a bad future, but we can work towards a better future. And that's, I think, what I'm asking readers to do, is to imagine. I feel like climate books have encouraged us to contemplate us losing everything we love and like work, sort of act out of motivation of fear and anger and loss. And I think that we can also act out of, maybe it's even more effective to act out of this like irresistible desire for the better world. Like you can imagine Savannah even being better than it is right now in the future, even during climate change, as some of these, sea level rise will happen in our lifetime. It will flood Savannah more often. There's really no way around that because of ice sheet dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it could be, 10 centimeters instead of 200 centimeters.
That's right. That's right.
It doesn't have to be a catastrophe. It can happen without being a catastrophe.
That's right. Yeah, and I think you did mention Brene Brown's work, right? In terms of her, so she's a psychological researcher and writer and presenter. Her research and her professional career, she's built up this picture that, shame, motivating by shame doesn't really work that well, that it's not really that effective.
Mm-hmm.
It's often what people go to. It's almost an instinct that seems to exist of like, well, if you just, go to shame and go to making people feel scared, then, that's going to work. But, her research shows that that's definitely not the case, that people
if
tend
anything,
to...
they do the opposite of what you want.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
they're like reinforce and get defensive and say, no, like I need to preserve myself as this person is attacking me.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, that's one of the things that I definitely noticed culturally growing up in the Southeast, is that any attempts to induce guilt over environmental issues tended to ended up in a very strong emotional reaction going the other way, going towards just dismissing all the science and focusing on, individualism and focusing on, like you said, self-preservation, which, I mean, to be fair, I do want to be fair to the ego here. The ego does have a role to play. The ego there is a role for self-protection in all of this. There is a role for looking after yourself and making sure you're all right. It's not like I'm not envisioning a world where, where people don't take care of themselves. That's a crucial part of the story, isn't it? You have to take care of your own emotional well-being and your physical well-being and social well-being. That's critical. So in fact, that's kind of where a lot of this can start. Like if you are taking good care of yourself, then that makes it easier for you to care about other people. If you love yourself, it becomes easier to love other people and extend that love outwards. And that's sometimes one of the fundamental kind of challenges, is figuring out like, how do you love and accept and be kind to yourself so that you have a good foundation for love, extending that love and caring to other people and to society at large. Trauma makes that difficult for some people, right? And some people, they reach out enough times and they maybe experience some kind of negative backlash, or maybe a betrayal of trust or something like that.
You learn not to trust people. Yeah.
Yeah. And then those traumas make them withdraw inwards. And I almost feel like we're kind of seeing something like that on a large scale. There's this kind of rising tide of nationalism and xenophobia and of this way of thinking that like, no, I'm special. I'm part of the special group and I don't need to share with any of you. And I don't need to even cooperate or think about any of you because I can just be special in my corner over here. And I don't know if that's a response to large scale trauma or what, but one of the things that I like about your book is that it stands not so much in defiance of that, but it's offering this other way. It's saying, well, as opposed to withdrawing inwards and becoming more, nationalistic and xenophobic, we can imagine like, yeah, but think about how good things would be if we actually kind of improved the whole planet and improved the way we treated each other. And if, if we were more connected. So I appreciated that positive expression. I don't want to end with a heavy question along those lines, but like, could you say more about, what do you do with folks who just aren't going to buy into this, who are just like, nope, I've been burned too many times before. I'm not getting on board with any of this stuff. I'm going to take care of myself. Just because every other time I've tried to reach out and connect with something larger, something bad has happened to me, so I don't trust any of you. I'm not saying there's an amazing answer, but I'm sure you've thought about that, about what to do with folks who've kind of been they're on the outside of that for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. I do think it's somewhere where you have to get to a place of participation on your own, and you have to be patient. I don't think that it's productive to engage people directly, person to person, who are having that emotional reaction towards you. I think that it just they'll need more time. And I think that we are in I know that I would have had a different answer 10 years ago, because I think that we're at a moment now where people who are ready to create transformational change need to pool resources and do it right now. This week or next week. Like start to live in that world, that world focused on reciprocity as soon as possible today, if you can. And I think that is going to take enough energy that I don't know that it's possible. I mean, when that person is your parent or your partner or your child or someone, and you really deeply love them and you want to maintain a relationship with them, that's a different story. But I think if it's a random person on the internet that's approaching you with comments on your blog post or something like that, just let it go. Honestly, they can talk and think about it on their own time. And this is probably a reaction that they need to externalize for some reason, because they're so conflicted in their mind. And that feels, that feels like, being defensive is the first step to creating change in your own life. For example, it's pushing away the change. At least you acknowledge the change is there. I think that those people have a lot to work out still, and I don't want people to be using precious resources, honestly, that could be devoted towards creating the change right away. Maybe that's not a super popular, or maybe that is a controversial answer, but that's sort of what I've been doing in my own life and my own world. That's been my approach for the last couple of years.
So there's a focus on kind of connecting with people who are taking action towards imagining and pushing towards a better world, and
and that ends up in the short term increasing polarization, because people who are focused on preserving individualism or their own privilege will find other like-minded people to do that with. So you get those sort of like anti-mask movements and that kind of thing that happens.
These kind of self-reinforcing bubbles that show up.
Yeah, and it's dangerous. It is dangerous, but you can't counteract that movement on your own. Like the way you counteract it is by, like what I did in the book, hopefully, is building up a shared vision of a different way. And then they will, once that movement starts growing, they will realize that, I don't know. We're all doing this in extremely weird time with no practice. Like, we're all doing this together for the first time. So I don't know. The best answer is I don't know how to deal with it, but I think that's what I do.
I think what I hear you saying is that you have to accept that some level of that tension is going to exist.
Yeah,
which I think
it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable to do this work. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that can be hard for people who have kind of peacemaker tendencies. Like I do have that tendency sometimes. I'm somebody who I would love to get everybody on board, but
it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. I have to accept there's going to be some level of that tension that is going to persist, and all I can do is keep ringing my individual bell, and hopefully that will contribute to something bigger. So we're getting near the end of the time that I've got you for. And I thought we could end with just a couple of questions about what you've learned. So I wonder, could you say something about what you've learned about science that you didn't know before you got involved with it generally? This going back a couple of decades now, something that surprised you about the way that science operates?
Sure. Yeah. One thing that surprised me is that science never ends. And that's by design. There is no final point of anything that you are working on, really. And to think that there is sort of hubris. To think that you will fix something or solve something yourself, or even your entire research group. You can move a conversation forward, but you can't end it.
Yeah.
No conversation can ever end when you're working in science. I mean, that's what science is designed to do, is to constantly test and retest reality from multiple viewpoints. And we live in a world where there's nuance and things don't always happen the way you expect them to, clearly. Telling the same, let's say you're researching sea level rise, or you're working on the Thwaites Glacier project or something like that, where there's massive attention, massive importance. It's an urgent problem. Studying that problem, you can think of an infinite number of ways to study the problem. I think one thing that's really interesting when it comes to ice sheet dynamics is there are structural engineers. That's a major component of studying ice sheets is that you study buildings, or you study ice as a structure rather than ice as a physical process. That leads insight to how it works. I don't know. The more people that you can get with a more diversity of viewpoints from different backgrounds, having someone on your research team from Bangladesh who grew up hearing the world tell them that their country was disposable and expendable and going to be underwater anyway. So why does it matter? They will bring a different perspective to your extremely technical, science-focused study on ice sheets than someone would that grew up in Denver, where they didn't grow up with sea level rise as a threat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your background determines your perspective that you take. We all have these biases, and they are not something to be cleansed from us, but they're a strength when it comes to studying a problem from multiple different ways. Because the conversation, that's what the whole point is having a conversation with as many different viewpoints as possible.
Absolutely. I better get you out of here. I know you got another meeting in 5 minutes. So,
yeah.
Eric, thanks very much for talking with me. It was really nice. It was really lovely. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
There you have it. Thanks for joining us. I liked that. Did you like that? I thought it was a pretty different episode, but in a nice way. You can find Eric on Twitter at Eric Holthaus, and you can visit his website at ericholthaus.com. So nice job, Eric, on getting your name for both of those. That's cool. I'm at Dan Jones Ocean, and you can follow the podcast at Climate SciPod. Okay, so I said I'd share something personal at the end of each episode, but I don't know. This episode was already kind of personal at times, so maybe that's enough sharing for now. So my personal message at the end of this episode is the idea that it's okay to have boundaries. It's okay to control how much you share. So here's my boundary for today. Not going to share. All mine. I'm not closing up shop forever. I'll share more soon, but my instinct is to not do that today. And you can have that control for yourself as well whenever you choose. That's something that you control. Nobody else knows what you're thinking unless you tell them. So for now, take care. Stay well. Thanks for stopping by. And I'll talk with you next time. All right, I'm going to let the music play out, so I'll see you later. Yeah, I'm still here. You still there? That's fine. I mean, I don't have anything else to say. I hope you have a good day. Stay cool if you're listening to this in the summer, because it's hot. Drink some water. Go drink some water. Bye-bye.